They laughed at the man holding the mop. The janitor moved through marble hallways, built from his blood, past towers carved from his vision, beneath lights powered by his sacrifice. Houston knew his skyline but forgot his name. Thomas Hale once signed the blueprints that made men rich, but betrayal buried him beneath floors he now cleans. Preston Crane wears the crown stolen from a ghost. When a signature surfaces on forgotten plans, the CEO's face drains of color. Subscribe now, because dignity doesn't die, it waits. Thomas Hale pushed the mop across the polished marble floor with movements so practiced they had become meditation. The water in the bucket swirled with diluted soap and the invisible residue of 1,000 hurried footsteps, each one belonging to someone who passed him without seeing. The lobby of Crane Tower stretched 40 feet high, walls of glass and steel catching the Houston sun and scattering it into fragments that danced across surfaces Thomas kept immaculate. His reflection rippled in the wet stone beneath him, distorted and temporary, a ghost that disappeared as soon as the floor dried. He wore the uniform of invisibility, grey coveralls with a name tag that read simply Tom, as if the fullness of his identity could be reduced to 3 casual letters. His hands, calloused and marked by years of labor that had nothing to do with cleaning, gripped the mop handle with the same steadiness they once used to sign documents that moved millions of dollars across continents. Nobody in this building knew those hands had drawn the first sketches of the very tower they occupied, that these floors existed because Thomas Hale had once dreamed in concrete and glass and steel. The morning rush filled the lobby with bodies in tailored suits and clicking heels. Voices layered over one another in conversations about quarterly reports and client acquisitions and weekend plans that cost more than Thomas earned in a month. He moved around them like water around stones, his presence acknowledged only when someone needed him to step aside or when a spilled coffee required immediate attention. The young woman in the crimson blazer barely glanced at him as she dropped her empty cup on the marble, the liquid splashing outward in a dark stain that spread like accusation. She continued her phone conversation without pause, her laughter bright and careless as Thomas knelt to clean the mess she left behind. His knees protested the motion, the ache of 54 years settling into joints that remembered better days, but his face remained neutral, a mask perfected through years of swallowing humiliation. He wiped the marble clean, wrung out the cloth into his bucket, and stood again, resuming the rhythm of his work as if nothing had interrupted it. The woman never looked back, already halfway to the elevator, already forgotten. Thomas had learned to measure time not in hours, but in tasks. The lobby by 8, the third-floor corridor by 9:30, the executive restrooms before the afternoon meetings began. His world had contracted to these small territories, these manageable spaces where he could control something, even if it was only the absence of dirt. There was a strange comfort in the simplicity of it, a relief in having no decisions more complicated than which cleaning solution to use, or whether the recycling needed to be emptied before lunch. But beneath that comfort lived a weight he could never fully set down, a knowledge that pressed against his chest every time he heard laughter echo through the halls he used to command. He had built this company from nothing, had mortgaged his future and his family's security to fund the first projects that turned blueprints into buildings. The name on the tower outside used to be his, Hale Development, carved into granite at the entrance, a monument to ambition and vision and relentless work. That name had been chiseled away 5 years ago, replaced with Crane Tower, as if history could be rewritten with enough audacity and enough lawyers. The betrayal had come from the people closest to him, the ones he had trusted with access to everything. His business partner, Marcus, had whispered doubts into the ears of investors during Thomas's mother's final illness, when he had stepped away to hold her hand through her last days. His brother, David had signed documents Thomas never saw, transferring shares and decision-making power while Thomas was buried under grief and exhaustion. By the time he returned, the company had been restructured, his name removed from leadership, his ownership diluted into meaninglessness by legal maneuvers he couldn't afford to fight. Preston Crane, a young vice president Thomas had mentored personally, had risen through the chaos with a smile that never reached his eyes, consolidating power with a speed that suggested the coup had been planned long before it was executed. Thomas had watched his empire collapse in slow motion, every meeting a new humiliation, every legal letter another nail in the coffin of his legacy. When the final papers were signed, when he was escorted from his own office by security guards who apologized quietly, he had felt something inside him break that no amount of time could fully repair. He found work where he could, his reputation poisoned by whispers that he had mismanaged funds or made reckless decisions that endangered the company. None of it was true, but truth mattered less than narrative in the world of corporate power. Months turned into years, savings evaporated, and Thomas discovered that a man in his 50s with a scandal attached to his name had fewer options than he ever imagined possible. The janitorial position at Crane Tower had been available through a staffing agency that didn't ask questions or check references beyond the basics. The irony of returning to clean the floors of the building he had designed was not lost on Thomas, but pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He needed the paycheck, needed the routine, needed something to anchor him when the nights grew long and the memories too sharp. So he took the job, kept his head down, and learned to become invisible in the place where he had once been seen by everyone. He told himself it was temporary, that he was gathering strength for some undefined future action, but 5 years had passed, and he was still here, still pushing the mop, still swallowing the laughter that followed him like a shadow. The elevator doors opened, and a group of junior executives spilled into the lobby, their voices loud with the confidence of people who had never known failure. Thomas recognized the type: ambitious, hungry, certain that their success was purely the result of their own brilliance rather than luck or timing or standing on the shoulders of those who came before. One of them, a man in his late 20s with perfectly styled hair and a watch that cost more than Thomas's car, noticed him and elbowed his companion with a smirk. The laughter that followed was quiet, but unmistakable. A private joke shared at the expense of the janitor who couldn't hear them, but could feel their amusement like a physical touch. Thomas kept his eyes on the floor, his movements steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He had learned that silence was armor, that stillness could deflect cruelty better than any confrontation. But inside, when no one could see, something ancient and unbreakable stirred. A memory of who he used to be, a whisper that reminded him this floor beneath his mop had been poured according to specifications he had written in his own hand, that every beam and bolt in this building existed because Thomas Hale had willed it into being. They could laugh all they wanted, but they were laughing inside his cathedral, walking through his dream, living in the world he had created, even if they would never know it. The laughter in Crane Tower had a particular quality that Thomas had come to recognize: sharp, performative, designed to establish hierarchy rather than express genuine amusement. It echoed off the marble walls and glass panels, amplified by architecture that Thomas had specifically designed for acoustics, though he had imagined those acoustics would carry the sounds of business success and collaborative achievement rather than mockery. Preston Crane moved through the lobby that morning with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world existed to confirm his importance, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the stone in a rhythm that announced his presence before he was fully visible. He was younger than Thomas by 16 years. his face still unlined by the kind of losses that carve permanent shadows into a person's expression, his body maintained by personal trainers and carefully monitored diets that Thomas could never afford. Preston wore power like cologne, something he applied generously every morning, and the employees around him responded to it with the automatic deference that comes from understanding where power resides and how quickly it can be withdrawn. Thomas was emptying a trash receptacle near the building directory when Preston entered, surrounded by a small entourage of senior managers who laughed at his comments with the enthusiasm of people who understood their bonuses depended on their ability to appreciate their leader's humor. Preston was mid-story, something about a competitor's failed pitch that he had witnessed at an industry conference, his voice carrying across the lobby with the projection of someone who had never been told to lower it. The details of the story were cruel, highlighting another person's nervousness and stumbled words, turning professional disappointment into entertainment for those secure enough to laugh at it. Thomas listened without meaning to, his hands continuing to work while his mind catalogued the casual brutality of the narrative, the way Preston wielded other people's failures as evidence of his own superiority. When the punchline landed, the entourage erupted in laughter that seemed too loud for the actual joke, and Preston's smile widened with satisfaction, his eyes scanning the lobby as if searching for an audience to appreciate his performance. Those eyes passed over Thomas without pausing, without registering his presence as anything more than part of the furniture, another element of the building's maintenance that required no acknowledgement. One of the managers, a woman named Catherine, who had worked under Thomas years ago, though she clearly didn't recognize him now, gestured toward the elevator and made a comment about the quarterly numbers that had just been released. Preston's expression shifted to something more serious, the performance of leadership replacing the performance of casual superiority, and he began discussing profit margins and expansion plans with the same confidence he had applied to his story. Thomas caught fragments of the conversation as they passed. Talk of acquiring a smaller firm, of restructuring a division, of pushing into markets that Preston claimed were ripe for disruption, a phrase Thomas had heard him use countless times, as if repetition made it more meaningful. The irony of Preston discussing disruption in a building that existed because Thomas had actually disrupted an entire industry decades earlier was so sharp that Thomas almost smiled. But he caught himself, kept his face neutral, continued his work. The entourage moved toward the elevator, their voices fading as they ascended to the executive floors where decisions were made and power was consolidated and people like Thomas no longer existed in any meaningful way. But before the elevator doors closed completely, one of the younger associates, a man Thomas had seen around but whose name he didn't know, turned back and pointed at something on the floor near where Thomas stood. His voice carried clearly, pitched for humor rather than actual concern, asking if someone could clean up the mess near the trash bin before clients arrived. The implication was that Thomas had created the mess rather than being in the process of addressing it, that his presence itself was somehow the problem that needed correcting. Laughter rippled through the group again, quieter this time but unmistakable, and Preston's face appeared briefly as the elevator doors were closing, his smile indulgent, his eyes reflecting the casual amusement of someone watching a mildly entertaining sideshow. Then the doors sealed shut, and the lobby fell back into its normal rhythm, the moment passing so quickly that most people hadn't even noticed it. Just another small humiliation in a building full of them, another reminder of how completely Thomas had been erased from the place he had created. Thomas stood motionless for several seconds after they disappeared, his hands still gripping the trash bag, his breathing steady despite the heat rising in his chest. He had perfected the art of swallowing rage, of converting fury into something cold and manageable that could be stored away until he was alone. The lobby around him continued its morning dance, people flowing in and out, conversations overlapping, the business of business proceeding without interruption. No one had noticed what had just happened, because to them nothing significant had occurred. A janitor had been near some trash. Someone had made a joke, life went on. But Thomas noticed, felt each small cut accumulate with all the others, building a weight that pressed against his spine every time he stood up straight. He finished emptying the receptacle, tied off the bag with practiced efficiency, and moved toward the maintenance closet to dispose of it, his steps as quiet and invisible as always. The laughter still echoed in his mind, mixing with older laughter from other days, other humiliations, building into a chorus that followed him everywhere he went in this building. The maintenance closet was a narrow space tucked behind the main stairwell, cramped and poorly lit, smelling of chemicals and old mop water. Thomas stored his supplies here, the industrial cleaners and replacement bags, and spare uniforms that made up the tools of his current trade. He had learned to take brief refuge in this space during his shifts, moments stolen between tasks where he could close the door and breathe without performing invisibility. Today he stood in the dimness longer than usual, his back against the shelving, his eyes closed, trying to locate the center of himself beneath the accumulated weight of years spent being erased. He thought about Preston's face in the elevator, that smile of casual contempt that came so easily to people who had never built anything real, who had only learned to take what others created and claim it as their own. Thomas had watched Preston rise through the company he founded, had seen him learn the business from the inside, absorbing strategies and relationships and knowledge like a parasite growing fat on its host. He had even liked Preston once, had seen something of his younger self in the man's ambition and focus, had mentored him with genuine investment in his success. The betrayal had been efficient and thorough, executed with Preston's characteristic precision, leaving no room for appeal or reversal. The worst part wasn't the loss of money or status, though those losses had reshaped Thomas's entire life in ways he was still processing. The worst part was the erasure of his story, the rewriting of history that turned him from founder and visionary into a footnote of mismanagement that had been corrected by more capable hands. Preston had told that story so many times in interviews and at industry conferences that it had become accepted truth. Thomas Hale had started something promising but lacked the discipline to scale it properly. His emotional decision-making and inability to adapt to market changes had put the company at risk, and only decisive action by the board and new leadership had saved it from collapse. None of this was accurate, but accuracy mattered less than repetition in the construction of public memory. Thomas had tried to correct the record in the beginning, had reached out to journalists and former colleagues and anyone who might listen, but his voice carried no weight against the institutional power of a successful corporation with public relations professionals and legal teams. Eventually, he stopped trying, stopped fighting, stopped doing anything except surviving one day at a time in a world that had decided his version of events was irrelevant. He opened his eyes in the maintenance closet, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to return to the lobby where his story had been completely forgotten by everyone except the man who had lived it. The third floor of Crane Tower housed the architectural and engineering departments, spaces filled with drafting tables and computer screens displaying complex renderings of buildings in various stages of development. Thomas cleaned these offices after hours when most employees had gone home, when he could move through the rooms without navigating around occupied desks or interrupting conversations. The work here was quieter, more solitary, and he found a strange comfort in being surrounded by blueprints and structural diagrams that spoke a language he still understood fluently, even if no one asked him to translate anymore. Tonight the floor was nearly empty. Just a few dedicated staff members working late on projects with approaching deadlines, their faces illuminated by monitor glow, their fingers moving across keyboards with the focused intensity of people who had learned to lose themselves in problem-solving. Thomas emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed these tasks thousands of times. His movements automatic enough that his mind could drift while his body worked. He was cleaning the conference room at the end of the hall when he noticed the blueprints spread across the large central table, held down at the corners by coffee mugs and staplers to keep them from rolling closed. The drawing showed a proposed commercial complex for downtown development, multiple buildings connected by elevated walkways, retail spaces on the ground floors, and office space above. Parking integrated into the structure rather than isolated in separate lots. Thomas recognized the location immediately. A corner lot he had identified 20 years ago as perfect for exactly this kind of mixed-use development, a space where the street grid and public transportation access and pedestrian flow all converged in ways that could support ambitious density. He had sketched preliminary ideas for that lot dozens of times in the early days of his company, had even purchased an option on the property before financial pressures forced him to let it lapse. Someone else had acquired it eventually, and now apparently Crane Tower was designing the development he had imagined decades earlier, though the execution was different from anything he would have created. Thomas moved closer to the table, his cleaning rag forgotten in his hand, his eyes tracing the lines and annotations that covered the large sheets. The design was competent but flawed, relying on structural solutions that looked elegant in 2 dimensions but would create enormous complications during actual construction. The load-bearing walls were positioned in ways that would require expensive custom steelwork. The mechanical systems were routed through spaces that would make future maintenance nearly impossible, and the foundation design completely ignored the soil conditions specific to that corner of Houston, where underground water flow could undermine traditional approaches. Thomas could see these problems immediately, his mind automatically working through the engineering challenges and identifying the cascade of issues that would emerge once construction began. He had spent his entire career developing an instinct for these details, learning to see buildings not just as static objects, but as dynamic systems where every choice created consequences that rippled through the entire structure. The blueprint before him was the work of talented people who understood theory, but lacked the practical experience that only came from watching your designs become reality and learning from everything that went wrong along the way. Someone had written notes in red ink across one section of the blueprint, questions about the structural calculations and concerns about whether the design could actually be built as drawn. The handwriting was rushed, frustrated, the questions growing more pointed as they moved down the page. Thomas recognized the signature at the bottom, Jennifer Rios, the senior structural engineer who had joined Crane Tower about 3 years ago. Brought in from a firm in Chicago with a reputation for solving complex problems. He had never spoken to her beyond basic greetings, had no reason to believe she would know who he was or that he had any expertise beyond pushing a mop. But he could see in her notes that she understood something was fundamentally wrong with this design and couldn't identify how to fix it. The conference room door was open and the hallway beyond was empty, the late-night quiet of an office building after most of its inhabitants had gone home to their other lives. Thomas stood alone with the blueprints, decades of knowledge pressing against his silence, the solution to Jennifer's problem clear in his mind, but trapped behind the wall of his invisibility. He shouldn't get involved, shouldn't risk drawing attention to himself, shouldn't do anything that might complicate the careful invisibility he had cultivated over 5 years of cleaning floors in the building he used to own. But the blueprint pulled at him with the gravity of a language he still spoke fluently, a problem that his mind couldn't stop solving even though no one had asked for his solution. The design could be fixed with relatively simple modifications, repositioning 3 load-bearing walls, rerouting the main mechanical shaft, adjusting the foundation depth on the western side to account for the water table. The changes would actually reduce construction costs while improving structural integrity, turning a problematic design into something that could be built efficiently and would stand for generations. Thomas found a pencil abandoned near the edge of the table, its eraser worn down to metal, its point dulled but still functional. His hand moved before his mind could fully articulate all the reasons this was a mistake, sketching light modifications directly onto the blueprint, adding notes in the margins, explaining the reasoning behind each change. His handwriting was different now than it had been in his executive days, less confident and flowing, more cramped and careful, but the technical knowledge poured out onto the page with the relief of something long contained, finally finding expression. When he finished, Thomas stepped back from the table and stared at what he had done, his heart beating faster than the physical exertion of his work warranted. He had violated the first rule of invisibility by leaving evidence of his presence, by revealing knowledge that janitors weren't supposed to possess, by making himself seen in a way that could invite questions he wasn't prepared to answer. But the satisfaction of solving the problem, of applying his expertise to a challenge that needed exactly what he could provide, was stronger than the anxiety. He set the pencil down carefully where he had found it, picked up his cleaning supplies, and left the conference room exactly as he had found it, except for the modified blueprint lying on the table like a message in a bottle, cast into an ocean he no longer sailed. No one would know who had made the changes unless they looked very carefully at the handwriting, and even then, they would have no reason to connect it to the nighttime janitor who cleaned their offices while they were home sleeping. Thomas returned to his work, finishing the 3rd floor with the same quiet efficiency he brought to every shift. But something had shifted inside him, some long dormant part of himself stirring back to consciousness after years of forced hibernation. The discovery happened 3 days after Thomas modified the blueprint, though he didn't learn about it until later when the consequences had already begun to unfold. Jennifer Rios had returned to the conference room the morning after his night shift and found the changes on her drawings, the modifications sketched with a precision that made her stop mid-step and stare. She had spent weeks struggling with the structural problems in that design, running calculations that never quite resolved the issues, arguing with the lead architect about solutions that all came with unacceptable compromises. The modifications on the blueprint solved everything she had been wrestling with, addressed problems she hadn't even fully articulated yet, and did it with an elegance that suggested deep expertise rather than lucky guessing. Her first assumption was that someone from the senior engineering team had reviewed her work overnight and left anonymous feedback, a kind of teaching moment disguised as collaboration. But when she asked around, no one claimed responsibility, and the handwriting didn't match anyone currently working on the project. Jennifer began investigating the changes more carefully, photographing the blueprint and enlarging the handwriting on her computer screen, comparing it to signatures and notes from other projects in the company archives. The style was distinctive, a particular way of drawing load-bearing indicators and annotating stress points that felt familiar, but that she couldn't quite place. She mentioned it to colleagues during lunch, describing the mysterious blueprint editor as a casual puzzle rather than a serious concern, but her curiosity wouldn't let it go. That weekend, she came into the office when it was quiet and pulled files from the archives, going back through old projects to see if she could find a match for the handwriting. The deeper she went into the company's history, the further back the files dated, until she was looking at documents from before Crane Tower had been Crane Tower, back when the letterhead read Hale Development and the signature at the bottom of every major decision belonged to Thomas Hale. The match wasn't perfect, because time and circumstance had changed Thomas's handwriting, but it was close enough that Jennifer felt a shock of recognition when she laid the modified blueprint next to a structural drawing from 15 years earlier. The way he drew corner joints, the specific abbreviations he used for materials, the habit of adding small explanatory sketches in the margins to clarify complex points, all of it was consistent across decades of work. Jennifer sat back in her chair, the archive files spread across her desk, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She knew the official story about Thomas Hale, the version Preston Crane had told repeatedly about a founder who couldn't scale his vision and had been replaced by more capable leadership. But the modifications on her blueprint suggested someone with extraordinary expertise, the kind of knowledge that only came from decades of actually building things rather than just managing people who built things. She began digging deeper, pulling up every document she could find from the period when Hale Development had become Crane Tower, reading through board meeting notes and legal filings and press releases that told a story of transition and improved management. But between the official lines, Jennifer found inconsistencies, gaps in the narrative that suggested more complicated truths than the public version acknowledged. Thomas Hale had designed most of the landmark projects that built the company's reputation, his signature appearing on blueprints for buildings that were still winning architectural awards years after their completion. His approach to structural engineering had been ahead of its time, integrating sustainability and flexibility in ways that made his buildings more valuable as the market evolved. Then suddenly he was gone, replaced by Preston Crane, whose background was in finance and acquisition rather than design or construction, whose expertise was in growing companies through merger and expansion rather than through the actual creation of new work. The transition had been presented as natural evolution. But the more Jennifer read, the more it looked like a hostile takeover dressed up in corporate language. And now Thomas Hale's handwriting was appearing on blueprints in the middle of the night, solving problems that the current engineering team couldn't crack, as if a ghost was still working in the building that bore his name before it bore Preston Crane's. Jennifer made a decision that would change everything. Though she couldn't have known it at the time, she printed out the original blueprints from Hale Development Archives, the ones with Thomas's clear signature and the matching handwriting style, and she brought them to the Monday morning project meeting where the downtown development was being discussed. Preston Crane attended these meetings personally when the projects were significant enough, sitting at the head of the conference table with the posture of someone who had never doubted his right to be there. Jennifer waited until the discussion turned to the structural challenges in the design, until the lead architect was expressing frustration about the delays caused by engineering problems they couldn't resolve. Then she stood, spread the modified blueprint on the table, and explained how someone had solved all their problems over the weekend with modifications that were brilliant in their simplicity. She watched Preston's face as she spoke, saw his interest shift to attention, saw him lean forward to examine the changes she was describing. Then Jennifer laid the historical blueprints beside the modified ones, pointed out the similarities in handwriting and technical style, and said the name that hadn't been spoken in this building with anything other than dismissal for 5 years. Thomas Hale. The conference room went silent, the kind of silence that comes when something forbidden has been named, when a truth that everyone had agreed to ignore has suddenly been placed in the center of the table where it can't be avoided. Preston's face did something Jennifer would remember for the rest of her career. It went completely white, the blood draining so fast that for a moment she thought he might actually faint. His hand, reaching for the blueprints, froze in mid-air, trembling slightly, as if touching the papers might burn him. Around the table, senior managers exchanged glances, confusion and recognition, mixing in expressions that suggested some of them knew more than they had admitted about the company's history. Jennifer had expected surprise, maybe some interest in tracking down whoever had modified the blueprints. But the reaction she was witnessing felt like something much bigger than curiosity about a mysterious editor. It felt like fear, like a carefully constructed wall suddenly showing cracks that threatened to bring down everything built behind it. Preston recovered quickly, his face regaining color, his voice steady as he suggested they take a break and reconvene after lunch. But Jennifer had already seen what she needed to see. Whatever the truth was about Thomas Hale and Preston Crane, and how power had changed hands in this company, it was buried deep enough that the mere mention of it could make the current CEO look like he had seen a ghost he thought was safely dead. Preston Crane dismissed the meeting with a calmness that cost him everything he had, his voice level and professional, even as his mind raced through scenarios and consequences that threatened to tear apart the careful narrative he had built over 5 years. He returned to his office alone, waving off his assistant's questions about his afternoon schedule, closing the door with a gentleness that belied the violence of his thoughts. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Houston's skyline, buildings rising into humid air, steel and glass monuments to ambition and capital, and the particular American belief that anything could be bought if you had enough money and ruthlessness. Preston had always loved this view, had positioned his desk specifically to face it, had spent countless hours staring out at the city he was conquering one deal at a time. But today, the skyline felt accusatory, each building a reminder that he was standing in an office that belonged to someone else, sitting in a chair that had been stolen rather than earned, wearing a crown that had been taken from the head of a man who should have been untouchable. Thomas Hale wasn't supposed to exist anymore, wasn't supposed to be anything other than a cautionary tale about founders who couldn't adapt to changing markets. Preston had worked carefully to ensure that narrative stuck, had repeated it so many times in interviews and board meetings and industry conferences that it had become accepted truth even among people who should have known better. The coup that removed Thomas from leadership had been executed during the most vulnerable period of his life, when his mother's final illness had pulled him away from day-to-day operations and made him emotionally unavailable for the kind of political maneuvering required to maintain power. Preston had seen the opportunity and taken it with the cold efficiency that had made him successful, rallying the board with concerns about Thomas's focus and judgment, suggesting that perhaps the company had outgrown its founder's capabilities, positioning himself as the steady hand needed to guide the organization through its next phase of growth. The fact that none of this was true mattered less than the fact that it was convincing, that Preston told the story with enough confidence that people believed him, even when evidence suggested otherwise. But evidence could be buried only so deep, and Thomas Hale apparently hadn't disappeared as completely as Preston had assumed. The modified blueprint from Jennifer Rios's presentation lay on his desk now, the handwriting unmistakable to anyone who had spent time studying the company's history. Preston had recognized it immediately, even though years had passed since he last saw Thomas's signature on a document, had felt his stomach drop as Jennifer placed the historical blueprints beside the modified ones and connected them with the simple directness of someone who didn't understand the implications of what she was revealing. Thomas was still here somehow, still working in this building, still applying his expertise to problems that the current team couldn't solve. Preston's mind worked through the possibilities with the systematic paranoia that had kept him in power through 5 years of ruthless corporate politics. Thomas couldn't be working here officially. Preston had made sure his name was blacklisted throughout the industry, had spread enough quiet rumors about financial mismanagement and emotional instability that no reputable firm would hire him for anything significant. But the blueprints suggested he had access to the building, to active projects, to information that should have been restricted to current employees. Preston picked up his phone and called security, asking for access logs and surveillance footage from the third-floor conference room where Jennifer had found the modified blueprints. The security director promised to pull the information and send it within the hour, his voice carefully neutral in the way of people who knew better than to ask why their CEO suddenly needed to review routine building surveillance. Preston hung up and stood at the window, his hands pressed against the glass, staring down at the plaza, 40 floors below, where tiny figures moved like pieces on a board that he had believed he controlled completely. The possibility that Thomas was somewhere in this building, moving through spaces Preston commanded, was intolerable, not because of any threat he posed, but because his mere presence undermined the story that justified Preston's position. If Thomas was still competent, still capable of solving complex engineering problems that stumped the current team, then the narrative about him being a founder who had outlived his usefulness collapsed under its own weight. And if that narrative collapsed, people might start asking harder questions about how power had actually changed hands, about who had really made the decisions that transformed Hale Development into Crane Tower, about whether Preston's rise had been earned or stolen. The security footage arrived in his inbox 20 minutes later, several files showing the third-floor conference room from different angles over a period of days. Preston opened them on his computer screen, scrubbing through hours of empty rooms and brief appearances by various employees until he found the relevant timestamp. 2:15 in the morning on the night before Jennifer discovered the modifications. The figure that entered the conference room wore grey coveralls and pushed a cleaning cart, his movements efficient and practiced. The posture of someone who had done this exact task countless times before. Preston felt something cold settle in his chest as he watched the janitor approach the blueprint table, as he saw the man pause and lean over the drawings with an attention that seemed too focused for someone whose job was to empty trash and wipe down surfaces. The camera angle wasn't perfect, but Preston could see the moment when the janitor picked up a pencil and began making marks on the blueprints, his hand moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The modifications took less than 10 minutes, the janitor working with a speed that suggested the solutions had been fully formed in his mind before he ever touched the paper. Preston paused the footage on a frame where the janitor's face was partially visible, shadowed and grainy, but recognizable if you knew who you were looking for. He zoomed in until the pixels became abstract, then zoomed back out and stared at the face that had aged and weathered but still held the essential features of Thomas Hale. The recognition hit Preston like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands shake as he gripped the edge of his desk. Thomas hadn't disappeared, hadn't left Houston, hadn't even left the building that bore his name before it bore Preston's. He had been here all along, cleaning the floors of the tower he designed, emptying trash bins in offices where decisions about his former company were made, listening to people laugh at the janitor without realizing they were laughing at the man who had built everything they took for granted. Preston thought about the times he had passed maintenance workers in the halls without really seeing them, the way his eyes had skipped over people in grey coveralls as if they were part of the furniture. And he realized with horrifying clarity that he had probably walked past Thomas Hale dozens of times without recognizing him. The invisibility had been so complete that even the person who had orchestrated his downfall hadn't noticed his presence. And that invisibility had protected Thomas while he moved through the building applying expertise that should have been impossible to hide. Preston closed the security footage and sat in the darkness of his office as afternoon faded into evening outside his windows. The city lights began to emerge, Houston transforming into patterns of illumination that marked highways and high-rises and homes where people lived simpler lives than the one Preston had chosen for himself. He had built his success on ruthlessness and strategic thinking, on the ability to see opportunities and take them before others realized what was happening, on a willingness to do whatever was necessary to win. But now he faced a problem that couldn't be solved with boardroom maneuvering or legal threats or public relations campaigns. Thomas Hale's mere existence in this building was an indictment of everything Preston had claimed about him. And now that Jennifer Rios had made the connection between the janitor and the blueprint modifications, other people would start asking questions too. The truth had been buried for 5 years, but graves were never as permanent as the people who dug them wanted to believe, and sometimes the dead came back with evidence that couldn't be explained away. Thomas arrived for his night shift on Tuesday evening, with no knowledge that his modifications to the blueprint had been discovered, or that his face was now frozen on Preston Crane's computer screen in security footage that connected him to expertise janitors weren't supposed to possess. He moved through the lobby with his usual quiet efficiency, nodding to the evening security guard, who barely looked up from his phone, taking the service elevator to the supply closet where he kept his cleaning cart and the industrial supplies that defined his current existence. The building felt different tonight in ways he couldn't quite name. A tension in the air that might have been his imagination or might have been the accumulated weight of 5 years of suppressed identity finally pressing towards some kind of resolution. He began his routine on the second floor, working through offices and conference rooms with the practiced rhythm that allowed his mind to drift while his body performed tasks that no longer required conscious thought. The cleaning was meditative in its repetition, offering escape from the more complicated truths of his situation, and Thomas had learned to lose himself in the simplicity of it. He was emptying a recycling bin in one of the corner offices when he heard footsteps in the hallway, expensive shoes on polished floor, the confident stride of someone who owned the space they walked through. Thomas didn't look up immediately, assuming it was one of the late working executives passing through on their way to somewhere else. But the footsteps stopped at the office doorway, and a voice he recognized with visceral clarity said his name. Not Tom, the casual diminishment printed on his name tag, but Thomas, his full name spoken with the weight of acknowledgement, and something else underneath that sounded almost like fear. Thomas turned slowly, his hands still holding the recycling bin, and found Preston Crane standing in the doorway watching him with an expression that managed to combine shock and calculation in equal measure. They stared at each other across the small office, years of history compressed into the space between them, the truth of Thomas's presence and Preston's recognition changing everything in the span of a few seconds. Preston stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face, as if afraid that looking away might make him disappear. Thomas set down the recycling bin with careful precision, straightened to his full height, and met Preston's gaze with a steadiness that came from having nothing left to lose. The silence stretched between them, neither man willing to speak first, both understanding that whatever was said next would determine how this moment unfolded and what consequences would follow. Finally, Preston broke, his voice quieter than Thomas had ever heard it, asking the question that seemed to encompass everything. Why hadn't Thomas told anyone who he was? Why had he been cleaning floors in this building for 5 years without revealing his identity? Why had he submitted to humiliation and invisibility when he could have fought to reclaim what was stolen from him? The questions tumbled out with an urgency that suggested Preston had been thinking about this for hours or days, working through scenarios in his mind, trying to understand the psychology of a man who would accept such complete erasure. Thomas considered his answer carefully, weighing decades of silence against the strange relief of finally being seen again. He explained in simple terms that Preston probably couldn't understand because he had never known that kind of desperation. That when you lose everything and your name becomes poison in the industry you built, when lawyers drain your savings and whispers destroy your reputation, when every door closes and every option disappears, you take whatever work you can find to survive. The job at Crane Tower had been available and Thomas had needed it. Had needed the routine and the paycheck and the strange poetic justice of returning to the building he designed, even if no one recognized him. He had told himself it was temporary at first, that he was regaining strength for some undefined comeback. But years had passed, and temporary had become permanent, and he had learned to make peace with invisibility, because pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Preston listened with an expression that shifted between discomfort and something that might have been guilt, though Thomas doubted Preston Crane had enough self-awareness for genuine remorse about the consequences of his ambition. The conversation moved in directions neither man had anticipated, Preston admitting with surprising honesty that he had known the coup that removed Thomas from power was brutal, but had told himself it was necessary for the company's growth. He spoke about market conditions and board pressures and opportunities that required decisive action, trying to frame his betrayal in language of business necessity rather than personal choice. Thomas let him talk, watching the rationalizations pour out with the practiced smoothness of someone who had repeated them so often he almost believed them himself. But underneath Preston's explanations lived the truth they both knew, that ambition had mattered more than loyalty, that opportunity had outweighed ethics, that Preston had seen a chance to take something valuable and had simply taken it without concern for the person whose life he was destroying in the process. When Preston finished his justifications and fell silent, Thomas responded with the quiet force of someone who had spent 5 years thinking about this moment, explaining that no amount of rationalization changed the basic facts. Preston had stolen his company, erased his legacy, poisoned his name, and left him with nothing but the choice to disappear or fight a battle he couldn't afford to wage. But Thomas also acknowledged something that surprised both of them, that the years of invisibility had taught him things about himself and the world that success had hidden from view. He had learned humility not as abstract concept, but as lived experience, had discovered that dignity existed independent of recognition, had found a kind of freedom in being unseen that his previous life of constant visibility had never offered. The work was hard, and the humiliation was real, and the loss of everything he had built still burned with an intensity that time had only slightly diminished. But he had survived it, had found ways to remain himself even when the world insisted he was nobody. Preston seemed unsettled by this response, as if he had expected rage or demands for restitution or threats of legal action, anything except this calm acknowledgement of transformation through suffering. Thomas could see Preston's mind working, trying to calculate what this conversation meant, whether Thomas represented a threat to his position or a problem that needed to be managed, whether this moment required damage control or could be turned to advantage in some way he hadn't yet identified. The gap between them felt vast, despite the physical proximity, Preston still thinking in terms of power and position, while Thomas had moved beyond those calculations into territory where different metrics mattered. The revelation of Thomas Hale's presence in Crane Tower spread through the company with the speed of information that was too strange to keep quiet, employees whispering in break rooms and exchanging texts that tried to make sense of the impossible story unfolding in their building. Jennifer Rios's discovery about the modified blueprints had opened a door that couldn't be closed. And once Preston Crane confirmed that the nighttime janitor was indeed the company's founder, the questions multiplied faster than any public relations strategy could contain them. Senior managers who had been part of the transition from Hale Development to Crane Tower found themselves facing uncomfortable inquiries about exactly how that transition had occurred. While newer employees struggled to reconcile the official narrative they had been told with the reality of a brilliant engineer cleaning toilets in the building he had designed. The story reached local media within 48 hours. Business reporters who covered the Houston commercial real estate market, sensing something larger than a simple human interest piece about a fallen entrepreneur. They started digging into the company's history, reviewing public records from the transition period, interviewing people who had left the firm around the time of Thomas's removal. Preston Crane found himself in the impossible position of having to explain why he had allowed the company's founder to work as a janitor for 5 years without apparently recognizing him or acknowledging his contributions. The official statements from corporate communications tried to frame it as a failure of internal systems, suggesting that Thomas had been hired through a staffing agency under a shortened name and that proper background checks had somehow missed his identity. But this explanation satisfied no one, least of all the board members, who began asking harder questions about Preston's judgment and character, wondering what other truths he might have hidden or manipulated during his tenure as CEO. Investors called emergency meetings to discuss the implications, not because Thomas, working as a janitor, affected the company's financial performance, but because the optics were devastating and the questions it raised about leadership ethics threatened to undermine confidence in the organization. Preston tried to control the narrative through interviews where he expressed shock and concern about Thomas's situation, pledging to investigate how this had happened and to ensure nothing similar could occur in the future. But his words rang hollow against the basic facts that anyone could verify. He had taken Thomas's company, erased his contributions, and then apparently felt no obligation to ensure his well-being, even when Thomas was literally working in the same building. Thomas himself became the center of attention he had spent 5 years avoiding, journalists and former colleagues and people he barely knew reaching out for his version of events, wanting to hear the story of his fall and his years of invisibility directly from the man who had lived it. He found the attention exhausting and invasive, preferring the simplicity of his maintenance work to the complexity of becoming a public symbol for workplace injustice or corporate betrayal or whatever narrative people wanted to project onto his experience. But he also recognized that his visibility created an opportunity to reclaim some of what had been taken from him, not in terms of position or money, but in terms of truth and acknowledgement. He agreed to a single interview with a business journalist he respected, someone who had covered his work in the early days of Hale Development with accuracy and fairness. In that interview, conducted in a coffee shop far from Crane Tower, Thomas spoke with careful honesty about the betrayal that had destroyed his company, the legal maneuvers that had left him powerless, the years of survival work that had brought him back to the building where his career had begun and ended. He didn't rage or accuse or demand restitution. He simply told his story with the dignity of someone who had survived something that should have broken him completely. The interview went viral in ways that surprised everyone, shared across social media platforms, and discussed in business schools, and cited in think pieces about corporate governance and the treatment of founders. Thomas became briefly famous, his face appearing in publications that had ignored him during his years of invisibility, his story resonating with anyone who had ever felt erased or undervalued or cast aside by systems that claimed to measure merit but actually rewarded ruthlessness. Job offers arrived from firms that wanted to associate themselves with his expertise and his story, opportunities that would have been impossible 6 months earlier, suddenly materializing now that his name carried different connotations. Thomas considered these offers carefully, weighing his need for stability against his desire to return to the work he had loved before everything collapsed. He accepted a position with a mid-size architectural firm that specialized in sustainable commercial development, a role that would let him design again without the pressure of running a company or managing the politics that had ultimately destroyed him. The salary was modest by executive standards, but generous compared to what he had been earning. Enough to restore some financial security and begin rebuilding a life that felt authentic rather than provisional. Preston Crane's position became increasingly untenable as the scandal continued to generate attention and questions, the board finally acknowledging that his leadership had created liabilities that outweighed his contributions to the company's growth. He resigned under pressure 4 months after Thomas's identity was revealed, accepting a separation package that would keep him comfortable while removing him from the public eye, where his presence had become a reminder of corporate excess and ethical failure. Thomas felt no satisfaction in Preston's fall, no sense that justice had been served or that scores had been settled. The man who had betrayed him was facing consequences for his actions, but those consequences didn't undo the years Thomas had lost, or restore the company he had built, or repair the relationships that had been damaged by the scandal surrounding his removal. Some things couldn't be fixed no matter how the story ended. And Thomas had learned during his years of invisibility that closure was a myth people told themselves to make sense of experiences that would never fully make sense. But he had also learned that survival was its own form of victory, that maintaining dignity through humiliation was an achievement no one could take away, that building something new from the ruins of what was destroyed required courage that most people would never have to find in themselves. On his final day at Crane Tower, Thomas walked through the building one last time as the person he had actually been all along, rather than the role he had played for 5 years. Employees stopped him in hallways to shake his hand and express admiration for his resilience, some of them apologizing for moments of casual cruelty they had directed at the janitor without realizing who he was. Thomas accepted these gestures with grace, understanding that most people hadn't been deliberately cruel, but simply unaware. That invisibility protected the comfortable from having to see the humanity in everyone around them. He stood in the marble lobby he had designed, looking up at the 40-foot ceiling and the light pouring through glass walls he had specified in blueprints drawn decades earlier, feeling the strange mix of loss and pride that comes from seeing something you created continue to exist even after you've been erased from its story. The building would stand for generations, would shelter thousands of people who would never know his name or understand his contribution. And that anonymity no longer felt like theft, but like the natural order of things. We build the world for people who come after us, and if we're lucky, we get to see some small part of what we made. But the work outlives us, regardless of whether anyone remembers we were ever here. Thomas left Crane Tower through the main entrance this time, rather than the service door, walked out into Houston sunshine that felt warmer than it had in years, and moved forward into whatever came next with the hard-won knowledge that he had survived the worst that betrayal and loss could do to him, and come out the other side still himself, still capable, still carrying the expertise and dignity that no one could ever fully take away, no matter how completely they tried to erase him from the story he had written in steel and glass and stone.